I'm sure we all have that experience where we hear a quote or we hear a statement and we may not memorize it word for word, but it really kind of sticks with us. And there's this one quote that I read a number of years ago that has always, I really resonated with, and it comes from the author C.S. Lewis. Let's try this again. There we go. The author C.S. Lewis, you may know him from his work with the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote that children's series that began with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Just an incredible author in terms of what he has written. But there's this one quote that you kind of laugh at a little bit, or I did, but it really hits home. And it's simply this: forgiveness is a wonderful thing until you have someone to forgive. I don't think anyone in this world would disagree with the concept of forgiveness, with the ideology that, you know what, to forgive someone is really a better way to live, and you can know that, you can understand that, you can appreciate it, you can believe it, but then it happens. Someone hurts you, someone wrongs you, someone mistreats you, and your natural response probably isn't, I am so ready to forgive. So ready. I just waited for this opportunity. I'm just glad this situation happened so that now I can. We understand this reality. We understand the importance and the significance, particularly when we follow the teachings of Jesus. We realize that when Jesus talks about forgiveness, this is not just some sort of off-the-cuff comment. This is not just some sort of principle. This is a command that Jesus gives. He's like, listen, when he taught the disciples how to pray, he kind of snuck it in there and said, you know, you can pray for your forgiveness, but in the same way that you forgive others, this is how God will forgive you. And so as God is our Heavenly Father, it's like a parent speaking to his child. When a parent says, I want you to do this, you want them to follow suit. And so the question becomes, okay, well, how does this become a reality in our life? If you're with us last week, we've just been kind of finishing up on this series on prayer, on our conversations with God, and we focused in on that reality when Jesus tells us specifically who to pray for. When Jesus doesn't spend a lot of time saying, listen, pray for those you care about, pray for your family, pray for your friends. No, Jesus lays it right out there and says, I want you to pray for those who mistreat you. And at the end of that, we had a bit of a time to kind of discuss, and some questions came, and real great questions as people are honestly wrestling with this issue. And I'm sure you perhaps went home and thought, yeah, forgiveness, this. I mean, I struggle with that. I struggle with this in my own life. I struggle with the fact that even when we want to forgive, sometimes the emotions don't come along with me. There's still this sense of anger or bitterness or rage, and the list goes on and on. And so how do we deal with that? And I think sometimes we do a disservice when we simply say, yeah, I need to forgive, but then we don't talk practically about what does this begin to look like? And also, what does forgiveness not necessarily mean? And so this morning I want to kind of just talk through some of the issues as I've been thinking about it more this week, and as I've been talking to others. I realize I'm not going to be able to touch on absolutely everything, but I want to give you guys an opportunity as well as we have the last few weeks to perhaps ask questions, to perhaps interject with situations. And so I don't often give this invitation, so let's not get crazy with it, but if you want to interrupt me in the midst of it, to follow up or to add something else, we want to have this opportunity. Because one of the things that we want as a church is to honestly deal in open dialogue with things that we wrestle with. And I think right at the core of what it means to be a follower of Jesus lands this issue of forgiveness. And so we're going to turn to Ephesians as our kind of primary text this morning. If you don't have a Bible, you want to pull out a Bible or borrow one of our pew Bibles, you can do that. But we're going to land in the 4th chapter. And Ephesians is a letter that is written by the Apostle Paul to a group of Christians living in Ephesus. modern day kind of Turkey, for those of you who like to understand the geography a little bit. And it's a letter that Paul has written to people while he's in prison, so towards the end of his life. But Paul has spent over 3 years with these individuals. So it's not as if Paul is just writing down some words and sending it to complete strangers. He is speaking to people who he has spent a great deal of time with. And the letter of Ephesians, as so often in the letters of Paul, really gets broken down into 2 categories. The very first part of the letter is Paul again telling the people all that God has done for us through Jesus Christ. And that's the starting point for everything that we do. We never start with what we have to do. We always start with Jesus and what he has done for us. But then as Paul so often does, is he then transitions into the sense of, okay, in understanding what God has done for us in Jesus, this is not just a core set of beliefs that we hold on to, but it should begin to make a difference in our life. And so what Paul then begins to do is to break down practically what this starts to look like in our lives as well. Essentially, application. And what's interesting around the book of Ephesians, in chapter 4, we see this transition where Paul has spent the first 3 chapters, what we'd refer to, but kind of the first 3 paragraphs or pages, telling people again all that Jesus has done for us. And then he says, therefore, let us live lives worthy of this calling. Let us live lives in a way that truly brings glory to Jesus. And he begins to practically work it through. And he lands on this issue of forgiveness. And so I want to spend some time this morning just kind of pulling out various issues that have been a reality for me and perhaps resonate with you. And just spend some time focusing a little bit more on what does forgiveness begin to look like? What are some of the issues that we may be dealing with when we are desperately wanting to forgive, but it doesn't seem to be happening? The first thing that reminds me is when Paul says these words, and I'm just going to reverse it, but Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. Don't let the devil get a foothold. And when Paul uses those words, don't let Satan get a foothold, I think one of the places we begin is understanding that this is a spiritual battle. If we understand Jesus correctly in being all about relationships, about us in our relationship with him, but then in our relationship with others, the quickest way to scuttle that is by breaking relationships with the people in the world in which we live. Because when our relationship with others aren't right, it affects our relationship with God. Jesus himself said, listen, if you're about to bring a gift to the altar, if you're about to bring a sacrifice, if you're about to worship God, and you have anything, or anyone has anything against you, i.e. there's some sort of a broken relationship, Jesus says, leave the gift there. Go sort out the issue, and then come back. You see, that is at the heart of one of the realities that for us to be a follower of Jesus is we are having to deal with these broken relationships. And with Jesus, in his influence on us, and in dealing with others, the ball is always in our court. Notice Jesus says, you know what? Put your gift down and go. He doesn't say, put your gift down and then wait for the person to come to you and have that conversation. No, he says, put it down and then go. And I think sometimes we may dismiss this whole issue of forgiveness and not understand what is really going on. Is that in order to ruin our relationship with others, a great way to do it is to begin breaking relationship with the people that we come across with. And so it makes sense when Jesus says, listen, pray for those who have mistreated you. It's Jesus inviting us and reminding us, begin having the conversation with him. Don't think for a moment that we can do this on our own. Second thing I pull from this is when he says, in your anger, do not sin. One of the great principles, I believe, of forgiveness is that forgiveness is granted before it is ever felt. Right? Sometimes when someone hurts us, when someone speaks ill of us, when someone has ripped us off or treated us unfairly, there's natural emotions that come out. There's anger, there's resentment, there's this desire for retaliation. And I would say those are natural. We can't stop ourselves from feeling a certain way when things happen to us. I mean, it's so much deeper than that. And so one of the realities is so often we may fall into a place of thinking, well, I don't feel like forgiving. Well, no kidding. Of course we don't feel like it. Or on the other side of it, we may feel as if we've gone through the process where we are beginning to forgive and we've been praying about it, but it still doesn't feel as if it's taking root. And that's because the reality is that forgiveness is a choice. It's an action that we take. In spite of how we feel, we choose to forgive. That's why Paul in this passage, starting in verse 17, says, listen, don't be like everybody else. Live in a different way. And Paul uses this image of taking off and putting on. And in this whole area of forgiveness, he says, you know what? Take off anger, bitterness, resentment. Take it off. Take off malice and rage. And put on kindness, compassion, and a willingness to forgive. You see, Paul understands very practically that it's not enough just simply to say, I want to wait, I want to feel like I can forgive this person. No, Paul is saying, take the actions that are necessary and begin going down that path. I know many of you are gardeners, great gardeners in this place, and I claim to know very little about gardening. But what I do know about gardening is this. I want flowers and vegetables. I don't want weeds, right? Everyone still with me? I haven't broken any gardening rules yet? All right, good. So if I want flowers and vegetables, two things I need to do. I need to water and nurture the flowers and the vegetables, and I need to rip out those annoying weeds, right? Gardening lesson 101. There you go. And I think the very same thing is true about forgiveness. We may want to get to a place of forgiving, but we have to ask ourselves the question, what is it that we are nurturing? What is it that we are watering? What is it that we are allowing to grow in our life? Are we wanting to get to that place of forgiveness? That's why Paul is saying, focus on kindness, focus on compassion, focus on forgiveness. And then when those annoying weeds pop up, like anger and bitterness and resentment, rip them out and throw them away. You know, one of the reasons I don't like gardening, I would have no issue with gardening if I could get up in the middle of the spring and I could cut my grass once, I could pull the weeds once, I could do all the trimming once. But for whatever reason, God did not create the garden to run that way. You pull the weeds once, and guess what happens? The weeds grow back, and the weeds grow better than my flowers or my vegetables. And I'm like, what's the deal? And so what do? You go back and you pull the weed, and you get rid of it. And you go back and you pull the weed, and you get rid of it. And I think oftentimes that is the process of forgiveness. You see, we may have fallen into the misunderstanding that forgiveness comes easy, that forgiveness is not a process. And that's why Paul is saying, take off the feelings of anger and of bitterness and of resentment and put on kindness and compassion. And so that when those feelings of anger, of bitterness, of resentment come back. You take them off again, or you pull that weed again, and you continue to focus on the process. Any Star Wars fans here? Anyone? There you go. All right, I love it. Great line by Yoda. Grammar's terrible, but great line by Yoda. He goes, "Do or do not. There is no try." That's the reality of forgiveness. Sometimes we say, "I'm going to try this." What you're really saying is when you say, I'll try it, is, I don't really think this is for me. I'm not really interested in this, right? If your friend or your spouse says, hey, do you want to go to a new restaurant? Yeah, sure, I'll give it a try. You're automatically setting your mind in motion in the sense of you're allowing doubt to say, I really don't think this is going to work. I really don't think this is going to work, right? And forgiveness is not about trying, it's about training. Like, no one says, I'm going to try to run a marathon. I got news for you. You don't try to run a marathon because you're not going to make it. You train. You put in the practice. You understand the things that need to be put in place. And so often when we think it's all about our emotions, it's like we say, well, I'm just going to try to forgive. And we pray and we try to be kind and we try to be compassionate, and the feelings come back and you're like, Jesus, that didn't work. What else you got for me? And Jesus is like, no, you got to go back at it again. Great conversation in Matthew 18 when Peter comes up to Jesus. And I'm not sure if Peter was thinking of a specific person, maybe one of the other disciples, maybe someone else from his hometown. I don't know what he was thinking. But he comes up to Jesus and says, because he must have been thinking of someone, right? You don't just ask this random question out of nowhere if you're not thinking of someone. And so Peter comes up to Jesus in Matthew 18 and says, Jesus, question for you. How many times should we forgive people? Like 7 times? What do you think, Jesus? 7 times? And the great thing about that is the context is in the Jewish tradition, it was understood that according to the law, you were expected to forgive someone 3 times. That's it, 3 times. That'd be a little bit easier to follow, I think, right? And so what does Peter do? In typical Peter fashion, he's like, I'm going to double it. I'm going to double down and say, you know what? How about double plus 1? I'm going to go for 7, right? Which other people say, is the biblical number for perfection. But let's not get too caught up in numbers. Peter's like, you know what? The bar is set at 3. Jesus, I've been following you, and I realize that you teach at a higher level, and you expect more grace and mercy. So 7. How about 7 times? And Jesus is like, all right, Peter, you asked. Here's the answer. 70. Others translation, 70 times 7. Basically what Jesus is saying, no. There isn't a number. You keep forgiving. And what's interesting is I've always read that passage in the sense of if someone came in and hurt me, I'd forgive them. And then they come back and hurt me again, I'd forgive them. And it's the same action over and over again. I was talking to someone else this week and they said, no. I read that verse entirely different. It's you keep forgiving the same offense over and over and over again. I thought, yeah, that makes sense. Because so often, how many times do we recall the same person, the same event, the same situation? And it seems as if we continually have to call to mind and forgive over and over and over that same offense. Forgiveness is a process that we move through. It's a process that takes time. It's a process that is not easy. One of the good ways that I'm able to kind of evaluate in my own life if I'm going through the process of forgiveness is that when I recall the person or the situation to mind, I feel less angry than I did. If I feel more angry, then I've got some work to do. But it's a process that we continue to come back to. One of the things that's been helpful for me is an understanding that forgiveness is essentially a form of costly suffering. You know when Jesus says, pick up your cross, take up your cross and follow me? One of the ways we do that is by following the path of forgiveness. You see, forgiveness is more than just saying, I'm going to give up my right to hurt you back. And so if you speak bad of me, I forgive you, I'm not going to speak bad of you. But it's more than that. It's more than just saying it doesn't matter. It's over and done with. Whenever Jesus talks about forgiveness, he often uses the idea of a debt, right? And when you're in debt, you owe something to someone else. And so when someone wrongs you, when someone hurts you, they're in debt to you. And so when you say, I'm willing to forgive, you don't just simply brush it away. You're essentially saying, I'm willing to bear the cost for your sake. Whether it be emotionally, physically, relationally, whatever it may be, when you are truly beginning to grant forgiveness, you understand that you are bearing the cost for another. And so it's not helpful when we just kind of, use throwaway statements of, well, you know what, just forgive and forget. Just get over it. No, it's a process that we go through. It's a process that we go through, again, reminding ourselves again why Jesus says, pray for those who mistreat you. Because when you do that, you're bringing me in on this conversation. One thing I realized this week is that when we forgive, it doesn't mean that we immediately trust. You see, sometimes we may think that forgiveness and trust go hand in hand, that if we're not trusting the person to the same level, then have we truly forgiven them? And the example that I immediately go to is any time there has been infidelity within a relationship. And Jesus asks us to forgive. But when that trust has been broken, we may forgive, but we're not immediately back to the same place of trust. We have to earn that sense of trust. And so it's important for us to understand what forgiveness is, but also what forgiveness is not. And perhaps for me, one of the hardest things in dealing with forgiveness is recognizing that it creates an opportunity for me to begin to examine my own life. Now, I am sure there are situations where people have hurt us, people have mistreated us, and it was 100% on them. But one of the hard places to go to when we pray to Jesus for those who have mistreated us is for us in asking ourselves the question, what have I done to them? Is there anything that I need to own in the midst of this? It may be as small as 5%, but Jesus wants us to use it as an opportunity. And I know there has been times in my life when I have hurt others, or when others have hurt me, and I've been angry, and I've been bitter, and I've been resentful, and I've taken time to examine the situation and thought, well, how have I responded to them? And I realized that there's things that I need to deal with. When we examine our own life, it means we become more aware of the subtleties of unforgiveness. Remember how Jesus said, when someone hurts you, there is a debt, and we talk about forgiving the debts that others have caused to us? Sometimes subtly, we may try to exact payment from others, but in very sneaky and clever ways. And we need to be aware of the subtleties of unforgiveness, that when they pop up, we begin to repent of them. One of the subtleties of unforgiveness is, although we may say that we have forgiven them, we always kind of circle back and bring it up in little ways. And it takes a little bit back from that person. One of the subtleties of unforgiveness is we may begin telling others about what that person has done to us. Now, this is an interesting place to go because I do believe there are times when we have to speak with others, when we have to allow them to come and speak into our own lives, but not if it's a place where we're trying to stack the deck against another. The question was asked of, well, should we go to someone who has hurt us? And I go back to the place where we landed last week of it goes back to examining the motives. Are we going and confronting someone because it's going to make us feel better? Or is it because what they need to do? Because if we go and confront someone in a desire for us to feel better, I think we may need to pause and think about it for a moment. One of the subtleties of unforgiveness is we become demanding in other areas. And this is often in situations where maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a child, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a friend. And I've seen this creep up in my life, where someone has done something that has hurt me. And although I may have forgiven them, or so I thought I've forgiven them, and although I may not bring it up with them or with others, I suddenly become more demanding of them in other ways. Again, in an attempt to exact payment for what they've done. And one of the keys, I think, for me in dealing with forgiveness is I refuse to indulge ill feelings. You know, we may say that we have forgiven, we may say that we have moved on, but when those feelings come back, it's like that weed that is growing in our garden. We need to rip it out and discard it and move on. Because one of the dangerous places that we go, one of the ways that Satan gets a foothold, is when we begin to indulge these feelings and begin to allow them to play out in our life. Forgiveness may be one of the most challenging things that we are called to do. But in many ways, it is the centerpiece of grace. The centerpiece of understanding that if grace, rightfully understood, is giving something to someone they don't deserve, isn't that forgiveness? Being willing to mesh that along with mercy and just not allow that relationship to be ruined. We begin to see why Jesus says, pray. Pray for those who mistreat you. Because this is a journey that we need to go along together with. That's why Paul so practically says, take off the feelings of resentment and anger and bitterness. That's really what he means when he says, in your anger, do not sin. It means take it off, get rid of it, and begin acting towards the person in a forgiving way. And by the grace of God, we will get there. Probably won't happen in days. May not be weeks, may be months, it could be years. I remember one situation in my life a number of years ago where there was a couple of people who probably didn't even know that they had hurt me in the way that they did. And I moved on and didn't really see them anymore. And I thought I'd been dealing with it. And it wasn't until years later that I realized there was still this hole of unforgiveness in my heart. And Jesus needed to deal with it. 10 years, I carried that with me. I went back and spent some time in a social setting with some of these individuals. And it was amazing to see. There was no sense of anger. There was no sense of bitterness. I can't tell you the day or the hour or the month or when it even happened, but there was a transition in my life. And it just reminds me that when Jesus says, pray for those who have hurt you, it's an opportunity for us to partner with him so that we can truly get to the heart of the gospel. And that is restoring relationships with others so that our relationship with God will be right. I know this is not easy. I know this is not something we easily run to. But I want to encourage you. I really want to encourage you to continue down the path of forgiving those who have hurt you. But don't do it alone. Allow Jesus to come alongside. I do want to give you a couple of moments if there's a comment or a question. You ask a really good question, I'll probably preach my message on that next week, so have at her.
There's always a gasp of fear from my wife when I reach for the mic, so.
Mine too, and it's every Sunday.
Yeah, there you go. So a number of years ago, I was harboring some anger and bitterness. And so kind of in line with the question that was asked last week, what to do with the bitterness and with following the path of forgiveness, as I told my story to my friend justifying why I'm angry and bitter, he said, well, if you harbor anger and bitterness in your life, that's like harboring sin in your life. You don't want to do that, do you? And that was the end of the comment. But then my prayer became, Lord, forgive this sin in my life that I'm harboring anger and bitterness. And that's the prayer that worked. Not help me deal with this anger and bitterness, but help me deal with this sin in my life. And of course, the second thing that happens then, my focus is no longer on the person that offended me, but on myself. How can I be a better person in this, and how can I follow the path of forgiveness?
Thank you. Anyone else?
This is not a cynical question, it's a sincere one.
Yep.
How do you forgive Muslims? A couple of years ago, out east, they strapped explosives to a couple of their own Down syndrome children, gave them lots of spending money, sent them down the market, and telephoned the bomb. They just recently stoned a woman, pregnant woman, to death for marrying a Christian. How do you forgive those people?
Thank you, Peter. That is an incredibly sincere question, and for me, it's difficult in the sense of I'm removed from the situation. But I have to believe that as we go through the process, and I think that's the place to begin, of asking the question, Jesus, how, why? But I do believe it is a process of just beginning to ask those questions and to come to that place. And I have to believe that irregardless of what people have done, as horrific as they have been, that we are called to forgive. And I think of the history of our not Paris, but of Christendom, and the horrific things that as a church we have done in the name of Jesus, I think there's a lot of things that we need to ask forgiveness of as well. And so, yeah, I think those are the situations, those are the places where you never rush to. But my hope is that through the grace of God, we're able to get to that place.
So personally for me, and even along those lines, when I've forgiven people, I've forgiven people and then haven't thought about it for years. And then somebody will bring up, oh, do you remember when that happened? And I find the hardest place for me in forgiveness is when I try to analyze why that person did what they did. And I almost go back into, oh yeah, I can't believe that somebody would do something like that. So for me, and I know that you're talking about continuing to forgive, but the thing that always gets in my way is trying to understand why the person did what they tried to do. So is forgiveness trying to forget the reason why, or just not trying to put yourself in that person's shoes? Because that's when I struggle to forgive somebody, is when I'm trying to put myself in their shoes and say, I would never do something like that, so I don't understand.
I think my quick response is forgiveness is not necessarily a rational thing that we do. And in the sense of understanding what someone else has done, potentially could only increase our fury. It just does not make it easy. And so I don't think there's any, there's not like for me, I found there's not the 5 principles of doing this, of doing that, but of continually coming back to God and just continue allowing Him to work in us, and just allowing this to be a process. And so I think if there's things that you realize that are unhelpful, recalling to mind that becomes unhelpful, then just as they come to mind, just simply pray and replace, right? I think it's not enough simply to say, oh, I'm going to stop forgetting, I'm going to stop forgetting. What happens when you tell yourself to forget something? You never forget it. You have to replace it with something else. And that's why I think Paul says, take off and put on. It is the process of getting rid, but of including something into your life as well.
Yeah, I think it's very important, the point, that's really Christianity and that's Christ. Forgiving someone, it means, as far as I'm concerned, is when you treat that person, it's like our justice system. There's the balance. We don't hold a prejudice against someone because they're not a nice person or we don't happen to like them. We treat them with justice and fairness. And that's what it means to forgive, as far as I'm concerned. To love is to forgive and treat that person, not with prejudice or hatred or do things that will hurt them, but to love them and to show that understanding. But at the same time, when the gentleman brought up that situation, that horrible situation, we have a strong, important Christian thing that we defend our families and defend those who are innocent and defend our country. This is so very important. It's very important to us because without it, we have no freedom. If we don't defend against abuse and violence and hatred, then we lose because we don't have a free country. We don't have justice. We don't have a world of love. We're in tyranny and hatred and dictatorship. So it is important, speak up. And it is important to get involved if some abuse is going on, to speak up and defend. Doesn't mean you hate the person. Just means you're showing love and you're showing something that you believe in. Thank God we believe in something that's, helps others.
So I'm going to stop it there. So I'm sure you want to But you know what? I'll say this: it's the opportunity for us to continue talking. I think it just sees the reality of the situation of just how deep this goes. And just as kind of a final word, not for me, just watch the screens.